So thank you all for joining us. Good evening and welcome to the Book Club of California's live and online exhibition opening for Bibliophiles Beware, the Situationist International and the Art and Politics of Cultural Hijacking. And thank you for joining us here in the club rooms and our virtual audience on Zoom tonight. My name is Kevin Kosick, and I'm the Executive Director of the Book Club of California, and it's my pleasure to welcome you and host the webinar this evening. For those of you that might be new to us, the Book Club of California is a nonprofit, member and donor-supported organization that is dedicated to preserving and promoting the history of the book and the book arts. Oftentimes, we do that with a particular focus on the history and literature of California and the West. The book club publishes limited edition, finely made books, a scholarly journal, and keepsakes. We also host a year-round series of exhibitions and programs like the one this evening on topics including fine printing, design, typography, bookbinding, collecting, history, and much, much more. Now, if you're not a member of the Book Club of California, you should be. Or if your membership has lapsed, I consider joining the Book Club of California, and I urge you to go online to our website at bccbooks.org, where you can join the book club or donate to our cause. And now for tonight's program and our presenter. Bibliophiles Beware, the Situationist International and the Art and Politics of Cultural Hijacking is the title of our talk tonight and the subject of the exhibition here in the book club. And our speaker is private collector Mehdi El Hajoui. Now, Mehdi El Hajoui has been researching and collecting the Situationist International for over a decade. 2 decades?
15 years.
15 years. 15 years. A decade and a half, I say. Items from his archive have been exhibited at Princeton University, Indiana University, the Chicago Architectural Biennial, and museums in Geneva and in Berlin, among many others. He frequently writes and lectures on the subject, and he serves as a board member of Brooklyn in New York. His work is used to support marginalized artists working at the intersection of art and social change. Tonight, Mehdi will talk about the Situationist International, a revolutionary alliance of artists, intellectuals, architects, and political theorists. They were active between 1957 and 1972, and they are hailed as the last avant-garde of the 20th century. Their work has been described as the subversion of established cultural commodities as a means of propaganda. This exhibition behind you here in the club rooms includes numerous examples of this innovative practice and provides an overview of the history of the movement that maintain an ambiguous relationship with their own material productions. Now, if you have questions for our speaker, please use the chat and the Q&A functions on Zoom. We should have time at the end of the talk to take questions, and we'll do that from the Zoom audience using the chat and the Q&A, and from you here in the book club rooms. We're also going to make sure we have enough time for those here in the club rooms to view the exhibition and speak with the curator after the brief talk. And now, enough of me. It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker, private collector Mehdi El Hajoui.
Right. Thank you all for coming tonight. Can everyone hear me? Is the microphone working?
No.
Okay. Hearing me now?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Sure. Okay. Well, thanks everyone for coming tonight. I think Kevin did a bit of an introduction on who the Situationists International were, this revolutionary alliance of artists, intellectuals, architects, and political theorists. One thing that's really important for today is, and for the exhibition we have, is to understand that the organization's core concepts include that of détournement, which can be roughly translated in English as cultural hijacking. And that's the subversion of cultural commodity as a means of propaganda. It is a way of turning expressions of the capitalist system and media culture against itself. It had a rich legacy in the United States and elsewhere in the form here of, you can see the Sex Pistols, you can see the conceptual artist Barbara Kruger, you can also see cultural jammers, the Billboard Liberation Front, among others, and Adbusters, I think, on the left. So they all sort of relied on that technique. And so it had this rich legacy. And the goal for today is to really introduce to you a key to be able to understand all these things that are being exhibited in the cases behind you and right here, and to also have a sense of what would this cultural hijacking practice entail, and not only by the Situationists, but also by some of the California-based movements that were, to some extent, influenced by them. Okay, so the détournement or hijacking of comics is the method of cultural hijacking that the Situationist International is perhaps best known for. So how does it work? It's quite simple, really. So what you do is you take an existing comic strip, oftentimes an American type of comic strip or superhero comics, and then you alter the content of the speech bubbles to make the content subversive or to convey a message that is, revolutionary type of message. And in this exhibition, we'll present several examples of this practice by the Situationists and related group. And so what you see here is one of those examples. It's a broadside called in Our Spectacular Society. It announces the publication of one of the issues of the group's journals. And the opening sentence, to give you a sense, reads, "In our spectacular society, where all you can see is things and the price, there is nothing they won't do to raise the standard of boredom." Originally published in French, it would later be translated into English, German, a few other languages, and it would be reproduced on the covers of some of the major, if you will, avant-garde or alternative periodicals of the times. What you can see here is International Times out of England, Berkeley Barb out of the Bay Area, and there's also others include Georgia Straits in Canada. But it was sort of something you'd see at the time if you purchase, those alternative papers. Next is, and I'm sorry, the quality is not great, but I think hopefully you can get a good sense. This is about the May 68 riots. And they were, for those of you who don't know, the May 68 riots engulfed France. There were about, I think, 10 or 11 million workers on strike. It paralyzed the country for a month. But it was also something that unleashed a torrent of creativity in the form of these hijacked comics. And then I'd like to discuss just one here among the many comics that were produced at the time. And it's called The Proletariat as Subject and as Representation. The images here are borrowed from the intensely patriotic American action-adventure comic Terry and the Pirates. The speech bubbles, on the other hand, include excerpts from the Society of the Spectacle, which is the Situationist main theoretical manifesto, if you will. And the last panel of this comic, you can't see here, unfortunately, but it closes with the following words. "The development of productive forces shattered the old relations of production, and all static order crumbled into dust. Everything that was absolute became historical." And what's really interesting here is that the cartoonist for Terry and the Pirates, his name was a man by the name Milton Caniff, or Caniff, I think. Caniff, thank you. And he was profoundly patriotic to the extent that he had a variant of Terry and the Pirates appear in newspapers, military newspapers like Stars and Stripes. So he would certainly not have been supportive of this use of his material. So let's look at another one. These are, so one thing to know is the Situationist International, I think Kevin mentioned that, dissolved itself in 1972, but there was this rich legacy that I talked about, and many groups embraced its aesthetic and political legacy, and they produced some of these like detoured or hijacked comics, and these are three examples, two of which are from the Bay Area. The first one is from a group named Point Blank out of San Francisco. The second is out of Berkeley by the Bureau of Public Secrets. Someone might know Ken Knapp, who's the kind of sole member of that group. And it's true, it's a factual statement. And then the last one would be by this little known group, New Space. I don't know much about them, but the young woman kind of states, "My job is killing me day after day after year. I'm being bored to death." That's kind of the last speech bubble here, and it calls for the end of work and the usual. So those are some example of now one last example I'd like to finish with is I think you all know Brigitte Bardot, the famous French actress. I think she was popular mostly in the 60s. And this is a poster here for the avant-garde exhibition Poetry Will Be Made by All, Transform the World, which was held at the Museum of Modern Art in Sweden in 1969. The designer Ron Hunt, who associated with the Situationists, he explained that the gallery was a space for people to gather and discuss revolutionary ideas. The Black Panthers were there. They were in exile in Stockholm. There were lectures on May 68 and on theater groups. Now, the broadside features a detoured or hijacked image of Brigitte Bardot. She was at the peak of her career at the time. And in a speech balloon, she states, "Poetry will be made by all, not by one," which is a reference to the title of the exhibition, right? The other side features a fictional interview with the French actress where she's discussing the Situationists and May 68 and revolution, which is kind of hilarious. And this is a Xerox copy, unfortunately, of this broadside because it's nearly impossible to find. A lot of this material is very ephemeral, so getting your hands on it sometimes can be challenging. So let's move gears and talk about how the Situationists took over the university. And I call this section like hijacking the university. In 1966, and some of you may know the story, a group of unruly students was elected to lead the University of Strasbourg Student Council. And along with the Situationist International, they co-authored this pamphlet, which is called On the Poverty of Student Life. And they went on to allocate the entire budget of the student union to printing 10,000 copies of the pamphlet. And then in an act of institutional hijacking, they entered the university auditorium about an hour before the ceremony marking the beginning of the academic year. They placed copies of the pamphlet on each chair, and then with the intent that all the students and dignitaries would find them as they took their seats. As you can imagine, this was, and so they replaced the program for you, if you will, for the ceremony with their pamphlet. And so what was so scandalous about this pamphlet? Well, it was about the small sort of 28-page, 9,000-word pamphlet, and it offered a scathing attack on university students and accused them of perpetrating the status quo through their bourgeois ambitions. So, and it was followed by a call to action. It was asking youth to basically mobilize and be at the vanguard of the revolution. So, would not sit well with then, I mean, remember, like France was still an extremely Catholic country at the time. You had, apparently priests there, you had members of the military. So suffice to say, like the scandal was quite big. So that is sort of the story behind this brochure. And then, it kind of became it sort of became this famous as a result, and it made its way to the halls of the Sorbonne University. And was brandished by students on the barricades in May 68. And by some accounts, it's hard to know for sure, but over 300,000 copies were distributed and had circulated in the few years following its publication. I've personally retraced about 100 different editions. Almost all of them are unauthorized and pirate editions in about 25 languages. And you have a small selection here. So I will sort of show you what they look like. On the left here, you can see the original French language edition. In the middle, you have the English language edition, which was adapted for English language audiences. And then you have another edition on the right that is also an English language edition. And I just chose to show it because I think the wrappers are quite spectacular. So more here, you've got the one of the later Italian editions on the left. You've got a Portuguese edition in the middle, and then the German edition on the right. Then here you've got a Russian and Farsi translations. So it is many, many more. I mean, it won't bore you with all of them. There is literally like at least 100, probably more. But this became sort of a cult hit, if you will. Now let's move kind of to a very different type of material that some of you, I think, in this club might appreciate more, or at least it's kind of more in line with what I've seen in this institution here. And it's going to talk about how the Situationists hijacking sent to the city and how they produced material that was sort of in line with this ambition. So there was a gentleman by the name of Constant, and he was an architect and a member of the Situationist International. In 1959, he started designing an anti-capitalist utopian city that he called New Babylon. And this was in reaction to the triumph, if you will, of functionalist architecture. So you had the like of Le Corbusier and so forth, who had reached their peak at the time. I think Le Corbusier, if I recall, said something like a house or home is a machine for living in. So people had a very different notion of the city, and they really thought of them as and of architecture as purely utilitarian in their nature. And so with New Babylon, what Constant did is he put play and social connections back at the center of the urban experience. The city that he envisioned would be perched on gigantic columns with the ground used for traffic, so cars sort of driving in and out, and the upper levels would be reserved for pedestrians. The work would be fully automated so that citizens could devote themselves to all sorts of creative pursuits. And there would be no such thing as a home. The nomads inhabiting New Babylon would simply move from one place to another, and they would reconfigure those commonly owned spaces based on their desires. And at scale, the New Babylon would connect the entire planet. There would be sort of networks of loosely associated New Babylons that could have connected the world. And so what's interesting here, I mean, unfortunately, the project never progressed beyond a set of sketches, architectural drawings, and really kind of beautiful models that Constant created. And so what I do in this exhibition, what I display today, some examples from his limited edition New Babylon portfolio, and that gives you a sense of what this anti-capitalist city of the future could have looked like. So moving on to hijacking, what I call hijacking the museum. Let's turn to the situationist relationship to the museum. They not surprisingly viewed art galleries and museums as places that where art was dead. Sort of, they thought when art gets into a museum, it gets neutralized. All of its subversive intent basically gets destroyed the minute it enters the museum. So what should one expect from the group's first exhibition, and the only exhibition they ever endorsed, in fact, which happened in Denmark in 1963? Well, let's start with the title of the exhibition. It's Destruction of RSG6. It's a reference to a clandestine pamphlet that's called Danger Official Secret RSG6, which you can see on the left here, which was produced by the British group Spice for Peace in 1963 as well. And basically it was a bombshell report that revealed that the UK government had built RSGs, which is regional seats of governments, which were essentially large-scale bunkers where public officials could retreat in the case of a thermonuclear attack. And then from those bunkers, they could maintain law and order among the surviving population. So the catalog of the exhibition reproduces that cover, and it's a bit of a hijacking gesture that's more of an homage, perhaps, kind of echoes the sentiments from the British pamphlet. We have two copies of the catalog on display today, and I think this is actually an interesting story. One, which you can see here on the right, is in pristine condition. The other, though, shows significant damage. And there's a story behind this. The situationist who was in charge of the exhibition, his name was J.V. Martin, and he had his apartment firebombed by a former East German spy. And most copies of the catalog were destroyed in the fire. And this partially burned copy is among a handful that were salvaged from the apartment following its near complete destruction. And somewhat miraculously, it remains complete and the text fully legible, but it still has segments of this sort of destruction, which is, I think it's kind of cool. Now, the exhibition itself, let's turn to it. It was a rather subversive affair. Visitors journeyed through 3 rooms. The first room was called Shelter, and it threw viewers into an apocalyptic post-nuclear war world. The setup of the room evoked a nuclear fallout shelter, complete with a cot, cans of food, and a corpse represented by a mannequin in a plastic bag. The light was dim, at times flickering, and then speakers were blaring some loud, piercing siren-like sounds. So you can imagine walking into the exhibition and you're like, what the hell's going on here? Then, those, I guess, gallery goers would move to the second room called Revolt, and it consists of an installation which I show here. Each gallery goer was handed a rifle, and they were invited to shoot at portraits of the major political figures of the time. So Kennedy, De Gaulle, Khrushchev. You can see here the pictures that were captured during the exhibition. And then they would move to the last room, exhibition, which was also the smallest room, which was more traditional in nature and included cartographic paintings and a series of directives, which were situationist slogans painted onto canvases. And I think you can see some of them here. Now, interestingly enough, nearly all of these more traditional works exhibited were destroyed in the firebombing of the apartment that I mentioned. So there's a few left, but almost none. So that was their idea of what an art exhibition should look like. Let's talk about books. I mean, this is the book clubs. We should talk about the codex, right? So in an attempt to turn the spectacular commodity society against its head, the Situationists did not shy away from hijacking the codex. And there's a few examples I'd like to bring to your attention. The first one is from the Society of Spectacle, which is Guy Debord's sort of opus magnus, his theoretical treatise. It's also the unofficial manifesto of the Situationist International. Most interesting to us in the context of this exhibition is how it's filled with unattributed quotations. And they were all liberally borrowed from authors that Guy Debord admired. And he actually once wrote, which I think is a wonderful quote, "Quotations are useful in period of ignorance or obscurantist beliefs." And so this attitude stemmed from his belief that ideas should be freely shared and that they can build on one another. He also practiced a more, if you will, refined form of hijacking, which was building on the intellectual legacy of people like Hegel, Marx, Lukács, and other such, intellectuals. And so the first sentence of the Society of Spectacle reads, "In societies where modern conditions of production prevail, life is presented as an immense accumulation of spectacles." Readers of the Times would have recognized the reference to the first words of Karl Marx, Capital, or Das Kapital in German. "The wealth of societies in which the capitalist mode of production prevails presents itself as an immense accumulation of commodities." So he does that a lot without quotations, and the reader has to somehow be intelligent enough to grasp the references. There's actually pamphlets that have been produced where people track all of these and kind of reference them to make it a little bit easier. So that's just one example. On display today, for those who are interested, is 3 copies of Society of Spectacle. The original French edition with a fairly interesting provenance. It was Raoul Vaneigham's copy. So he was the other major figure of the movement. The original English language edition, which actually belonged to the translator, and the original Italian edition. Let's move on and see another type of hijacking in books. So in July 1975, there's this gentleman by the name of Gianfranco Sanguinetti, who was a member of the Situationist International, or former member, as the organization did not exist anymore in 1975. He authored a pamphlet titled "The Truthful Report on the Last Chance to Save Capitalism in Italy." He did so under the pseudonym Censor, posing as an anonymous high-ranking member of the Italian intelligentsia. In this capacity, Sanguinetti made the argument that the Christian Democrats should welcome the communists in a coalition government, and only by doing so, he argued, would they be able to maintain the capitalist order in Italy and prevent a workers' revolution. So it was printed in 520 copies, all of which were mailed to Italy's who's who of influential politicians, industrialists, union leaders, CEOs, journalists, and so forth. And, not surprisingly, it received near universal acclaim from that audience, and a commercial edition followed in October, printed in tens of thousands of copies. Now, fast forward 3 months to December, this other book, can't really pronounce Italian, but it translates as "The Proof or Proofs of the Non-Existence of Censor," was published by Sanguinetti, who revealed it was all a hoax. He hijacked the style of the Machiavellian political treatise to shed light on the cynicism of the Italian bourgeoisie. This caused a huge scandal, which contrasted with the, I shall say, fawning reviews that the Rapporto had earned just a few months before. And what we have on display here is a first edition copy of both books, neither of which was sold to the public and therefore nearly impossible to obtain. Because unless your industrialist was mailed one of the copies, you just didn't get one. So lastly, and this is, some of you may be familiar with this, it's one of the more famous sort of ways in which the Situationists hijack books is in the way they've chosen to hijack artist books. And so I want to talk about two works by Guy Debord, who was the political leader of the Situationist International, and by Asgharian, who was its most emblematic artist. And so they produced these two books together within a span of 2 years. Fin de Copenhague, End of Copenhagen on the right, and then Mémoire, which is Memories on the left. On the surface, the two volumes have all the bearings of an artist book, the kind of things that a lot of people would pick up at Codex and be happy with, right? It's like they're scarce. They were releasing editions of like one of them was 500, the other was 200, and signed and numbered and signed copies. There was great attention to form. Permild and Rosengren, who was the leading Danish printer of the time, he actually printed everything by the Cobra movement. He produced the luxurious volumes and spared no expense. They were also either given, but when they were sold for a fairly expensive price. So that's sort of to say, okay, so on the one hand, maybe this is no different than, say, I don't know, Dieter Roth or Marcel Brothers, whoever your favorite book artist is, right? But then if you look at it a little more closely, something's happening here, which in my view makes those masterpieces of détournement, cultural hijacking. And it happens at the level of both content and form. So at the level of form, for Mémoire, well, the destructive intent is pretty clear. The book is best known for its wrappers, which consists of a single sheet of heavy-grade sandpaper, you can see on the left, and are intended to cause damage to other books on library shelves. The meaning, on the other hand, behind Fin de Copenhague's blue-gray publisher bindings is a little less immediately obvious, but what's people at the time would have known that these are made of flanc, which is a material that was discarded during the production of newspaper. And so here what the Situationists did is they're turning this wasted material into art, instead of commenting on the contradictions that are inherent to the artist book. So that this someone's trash ends up being someone's artist book, and this is sort of what's at play here. Now, if you talk about content, this is an example for a spread of one of the books from Fin de Copenhague. The Fin de Copenhague was made of scraps from repurposed material, much of which originated from Danish magazines and newspapers that the authors, Debord and Jorn, had stolen from a news agent when they arrived in Copenhagen. They viewed the content they use, press articles and advertisements, as for press articles as political propaganda, and for advertisements as cultural garbage. And so by taking these elements out of context, rearranging them, they're exposing their alienated dimension, but they're also giving them this newfound authenticity and newfound meaning. And so again, it's this idea of like using the garbage of consumer society to create something that is sort of worthy of attention. So that's sort of their view of artist books. Let's move on to film. So Situationist cinema is scandalous because it rejects several of the key premises of cinema or filmmaking. There's kind of first premise, a film should have images. Who would have thought, right? Well, they did not agree with this. And so Guy Debord's inaugural film, House for Sade, consists of alternating white and black screens. On June 30th, 1952, it was premiered at an avant-garde cinema in Paris. A few minutes into the feature, a narrative voice, part of the soundtrack, stated, "There is no film, cinema is dead, there can't be film anymore." Many of the viewers walked out, others loudly protested, the screening was abruptly interrupted and would not resume. And on display today are numerous artifacts related to that particular film and to that screening, including the announcement leaflet from this particular screening. So that's sort of first premise. Second premise is cinema should include novel visual content. It's like, well, if you're making a movie, you should show things that haven't been shown before, right? Well, Situationists valid that principle by making films that lacked any original material. The Society of the Spectacle is an 88-minute feature that contains no original material whatsoever. Every shot is quote unquote borrowed. I mean, it should really say stolen because they didn't go and seek out the copyrights, as you could imagine. Stolen then from existing footage, including TV ads, news reports, documentaries, other films. So that's the images. The soundtrack, on the other hand, consisted of excerpts from Guy Debord's namesake book, Society of the Spectacle. And so the contrast, you can imagine, was quite stark. And he was reading those excerpts from his book in this extremely like monotonous voice. It's quite something. On the left, what you can see here is the front wrapper of the press kit released on the occasion of the film. It includes a brief introduction, excerpts from press articles, and a biography of the filmmaker. On the right is one of many bootleg VHS tapes of the film. In 1984, Debord was accused by the press of murdering his friend and mentor, Gérard Lebovici. And as a in protest, if you will, of this wrongful accusation, he decided to withdraw all his films from circulation. And that pause lasted about 21 years, from 1984 to 2005. And so for those 21 years or so, the only way to see those films was to get bootleg copies. And so there's actually a ton of them circulating. And in 2005, and you can see here on the bottom, his complete cinematographic work were re-released as part of a limited edition DVD box set. Now let's turn to the third another premise of cinema, which is images and sound should work together to create an immersive, or at least a coherent experience. In an approach that's not altogether different from Hijack Comics, Situationists purposefully disrupted the synchronous relationship. In Can Dialectics Break Bricks, René Viennet takes a B-list martial arts film, which was called Crush, which is kind of on the right-hand side. And then he turns it into a story of revolutionary class struggle. And the way he does so is by keeping all of the images from the 1973 Hong Kong Kung Fu film, and then replacing the soundtrack, Chinese language soundtrack, through some, shall we say, creative dubbing of the original Chinese, to alter the plot to like reflect, class struggle. And so what you can see here, which I think is also amazing, is he's basically taking the same poster and just changed the title. So it is kind of, and you can see some of the material tied to that film here, the poster advertising the film, some bootleg DVD versions, and more. Actually, these film has not been re-released officially, so the only way to see them is still bootleg or on the internet. Okay, I think two more things before we close, maybe two or three. Let's talk about board games. So I went on to Merriam-Webster's and looked up what's a game. Game is a form of structured play engaged in for diversion or amusement. So in other words, games are a distraction, they're a reprieve, they're a chance to forget about life's hardships, if only for a few moments. Now, Guy Debord turns this paradigm on its head. For him, board games are meant to inform life struggles. In his 1989 book, Panegyric, he explains, I have studied the logic of war. Indeed, I succeeded long ago in representing its essential movements on a rather simple game board. I played this game and in the often difficult conduct of my life, drew a few lessons from it. So the game of war, you can see here, is Debord's attempt to model the tactics of class struggle onto the playing surface. And the result is this Napoleon-era chess-like game that's played by two opponents, north and south. And you have natural obstructions that simulate terrain on the battlefield. And then the winner either defeats all of their opponent's troops or they destroy their arsenals. And what I have on display today here is this first commercial edition of the board game, which also include a game rule, game board, and then the wooden game pieces. It's unknown how many copies were released, but we think no more than a few dozens. And there were 3 luxury copies made that were made by this artisan in Paris and were with metal. And I guess unless you're the French National Library or Yale University, you don't have those. So that's the game of war. Now let's talk about maps. Situationists viewed urban planning as the embodiment of capitalist oppression. For them, modern cities were designed to meet commercial needs like maximizing trade flows. And the argument is not without merit. I think for those who remember, like a lot of the tree-lined boulevards that characterize Paris today were built by Baron Haussmann, and the intent was to facilitate commerce, but also to prevent or make it more difficult to erect barricades following the 1848 revolution. The Naked City and the Psychogeographical Guide of Paris subvert the codes of mapmaking to denounce Paris's transformation and more broadly that of the 20th century city. The artist took a conventional map of Paris, cut it into pieces, and then rearranged those pieces in a seemingly random manner. Bold red arrows were then drawn onto the page to connect those fragments, if you will. Two questions then arise. How should one read these maps, and what should they be used for? Well, the Naked City and the guide, they're both shown here, they outline a unique topography, that of what the situation is called an ambiance. And that's basically one's subjective experience of the city. These maps illustrate the concept of psychogeography, which Guy Debord describes as the study of the specific effects of the geographical environment on the emotions and behaviors of individuals. So what you have here is, instead of some dull administrative considerations, like the arrondissement in Paris, or whatever, someone in an urban development office has decided, what you have here is a map that reflects the feeling associated with places, and that's what defines their position on the map and whether they're like clubbed together or not. And the arrows represent the connections between those different subjective experiences of the city. So this gets us to the second question: what's the purpose of these maps? What are they good for? Well, unlike commercially available maps, which are useful from getting to point A to point B in the most efficient manner, like the psychogeographic maps here, they're meant to guide drifts. And drifts are defined as unplanned journeys through an urban landscape, directed entirely by the feelings evoked in the individual by their surroundings. So drifting, if you will, is the opposite of navigation. So navigation is about efficiency, it's about utility, it's about getting from A to B. Drifting is this intuitive, sort of chance-like, deliberately inefficient way of experiencing one's urban environment. And so it is a way, those maps are a way for situationists to give people a way to experience those drifts. And in resisting the increasingly predictable, somewhat monotonous experience of life in modern cities, it's a way to reappropriate the city and make it yours. Okay, last but not least, let's talk about painting. So détournement in painting is something that the artist Asger Jorn, who was associated with the Situationist, is most known for. So starting in the late 1950s, Asger Jorn would go to the flea markets in Copenhagen, and he would purchase kitsch paintings, and then he would paint over part of these paintings. And then he would, in doing so, he would imbue them with some newfound artistic and political value. Artwork that came out of this practice were known as modifications. These aesthetic, maybe anti-aesthetic, interventions aim to raise questions around the role of art in bourgeois society. And in the catalog to the inaugural exhibitions of these modifications, Jorn explains, "Be modern, collectors, museums. If you have old paintings, do not despair. Retain your memories, but deturn them so that they correspond with your era. Why reject the old if one can modernize it with a few strokes of the brush? This casts a bit of contemporary on your old culture. Be up to date and distinguished at the same time. Painting is over. Painting is dead. You might as well finish it off. Hijack, long live painting." So he created about 90 of those modifications between 1959 and 1970, and there's kind of two of them I want to sort of comment to explain to you. The first one is the Alarming Duckling. And I would love to own this painting. Unfortunately, I am not the museum Jorn, so you'd have to go there if you want to see it. It's one of the most famous paintings in the series. What Jorn does here is he draws this like gigantic, monster-like duck head, if you will, on a tranquil pastoral landscape. And the contrast here is both in scale. You have this gigantic duck that towers over these two small swans. I don't know if you can see them here. There's two small swans like right here. So that's sort of one. And then the color, you have these bright hues of green, red, orange, and yellow that overcome the more subdued fall-like tones of the original. So it's this extreme contrast. In this painting, one might read the avant-garde's desire to awaken modern society from its peaceful slumber. Somewhat ironically, the painting was vandalized in April 2022 by Ibi Pipi Orup Hedegaard, who glued a self-portrait onto the painting and signed her name in a black permanent marker. After the arrest, so she was arrested at the museum, she claimed that the editions were intended as a double modification and part of her artistic practice. Nevertheless, she was found guilty of destroying museum property, sentenced to 18 months in prison and $375,000 fine. Thankfully, the painting was restored. So this goes on to show what I mentioned earlier about museums is where Situationists believed art goes to die and gets neutralized. I mean, this is kind of part of this narrative. Let's close with this. The avant-garde won't give up. That really begins as a portrait of this innocent looking Danish girl. And so Jorn vandalizes the portrait by adorning the child's face with a mustache and a beard. And it's a reference, an obvious reference, I think, for people who would see this painting to Marcel Duchamp's El Hajoui, see on the right. And just like Duchamp's attack on the Mona Lisa, Jorn's intent is to shock the viewer, what the French called épater le bourgeois. So this is shock value, but things are not so simple. It's not just shock value, like Duchamp did this, so there's more to it. As art writer Rachel Wetzler skillfully explains, the titular slogan scrolled nearly illegibly across the canvas. The avant-garde won't give up. You can sort of see it if you pay attention. Is insistently ambiguous, ostensibly proclaiming a sincere, ongoing commitment to the avant-garde project. Excuse me. While simultaneously mocking its failure to upend much of anything. And that's true, right? The avant-garde kind of ends up going to the dustbins of history. In many ways, this modification mocks and therefore interrogates both traditional painting, but also avant-garde art and its ability to change the world. So this concludes our panorama, if you will, of cultural hijacking by the Situationist. And I'd like to open it up for questions, concerns, comments, hijacking, whatever suits your fancy. Thank you.
Stay right where you are. Don't
All
leave.
right.
Let's take a couple of questions from the audience, and then we'll give some folks time to look at the exhibition. We're going to go John first, and then we'll go Chris.
This is about hijacking. Obviously, very fluid. You have this marvelous launch. Can you give us some notion of how you assemble all this? How this project started 15 years?
Yeah. I stumbled into one of the board's work by accident at a bookstore. I think it was in 2001. I think I only started collecting in earnest a few years after that. But and I was like, this is very interesting. And at the time, I was an undergraduate, and then one thing I'd considered is going on to graduate school, and I would probably have studied the Situationists in graduate school. Long story short, left graduate school, but remained interested in the topic, and then kind of began to assemble this material mostly for reading purposes. I was just interested in reading more of it. It wasn't readily available, and then over time, sort of come to appreciate the materiality of it and the ambiguity that is inherent to even just collecting this. I mean, there's something extraordinarily interesting about collecting material that resists being collected actively. I mean, Debord was very clear. He hated collectors. He liked nothing more than this. And so I just found that was kind of interesting to do that. And also I came to see that through my collecting and assembling all these items together, I came to make some realizations about the movement that I then sort of share more broadly with the public, either through talks or articles. And so it became sort of this side gig as doing scholarly work independently. And that's sort of the story here. But I would say I just really appreciate kind of the very ambivalent dimension of the material.
Where did you go to graduate school?
One second. Jacob, can you turn the projector light off back there so I can let everybody on
the
screen see or
Be
speak?
good. Harvard University. But I dropped out, so that's okay. I think we don't have I don't think we have Alex and Belair here, but he actually completed his PhD there.
Chris, we were going to you next.
There are reverberations of this movement, particularly with the Pussy Riot.
Oh, yeah.
In Russia.
Oh yeah.
I wonder if you could just tell the story about the Situationist interruption of the at Notre Dame.
Oh, yeah, so one of many things that I didn't cover today, but this,
Because the
so.
Pussy Riot group did this in Russia, leading to
Yeah.
prison terms.
So before the Situationists were the Situation 1952, they were part of this group called the letrace. I think for our purposes, it's all one and the same. But they wanted to do this kind of happening, and what they did is they had this gentleman named Michel Moore. He sort of dressed up as a priest and then entered Notre Dame during High Mass at Easter, and then stood on the altar and claimed like God is dead, you should all go home. And he was arrested. He was put in insane asylum. The really funny thing about this, which a lot of people don't know, is Michel Moore 2 years later wrote a book called Despite Blasphemy, and he converted to he became a devout Catholic, and then he became a prolific Catholic author. So this is kind of really hilarious. So as you could see, they're never short of like there's a very duplicitous dimension to a lot of this stuff, which I think is very interesting.
So there's a question. I'm sorry, you done?
Oh no, I think the other thing is, yes, and I think in terms of like them influencing, yes, they're not as the last avant-garde 20th century, but many movements, as I mentioned, like there could be a whole exhibition made on just like the influence of the Situationists on like 20th and 21st century culture. That could be a project.
The Pussy Riot group
Oh,
did
yeah.
the same thing in the Orthodox National Cathedral.
That's
in
right.
Russia, leading to, big consequences for
Right.
them. And they're in the press all the time.
Yes.
So I think this is an extension of kind of what you're talking about
Yes.
now. Does the cultural hijacking movement parallel the Fluxus?
Yeah, so I think there's parallels in the sense that the idea of material that tries to subvert the traditional art circuits. I think we see with Fluxus. I'm not a Fluxus expert, but my understanding of Fluxus, based on what I've seen, is the idea was to like find alternative ways of engaging with people who were interested in art that were more affordable, but also were not part of the traditional like museum gallery circuits. And so I think that part is very similar. The idea of like how can we disrupt this model? I think where Fluxus was a bit different is I think most of Fluxus is not as politically motivated. I think the Situationists had a political agenda, particularly in the second half of the movement. But there is like a large there's a lot of commonalities in how they think about the production of material. And the attention to like certain forms of art that are less kind of traditional.
And we're going to go back over here for your question. Do you still?
I already asked.
Oh, you got it. Okay. And then we'll do one last one here so everyone has time to look at the exhibition before we wrap up. Go
The
ahead.
hijacking is interesting. I wonder if you can speak a little bit about the actual philosophical, political philosophy behind the Society of the Spectacle, what the
Yes.
critique wants.
So that was, I think, the talk I gave 2 years ago,
Yeah.
which was this is more focused on like a presentation of the exhibition. So my goal for today was you can walk out this exhibition and look at all these and be like, aha, I understand why this looks the way it does and why it's important and why it's not just something behind glass. This is something that would be a whole other story, but essentially they believe that in modern sort of consumer society, the representation had sort of taken over. And the way to explain this is like you have a world in which you no longer connect with one another in an authentic manner, but our relationships are mediated through images. So the analogy that I like to give to make this very simple to understand is people they no longer sort of feel deep love for one another. What they do is they sort of have this shared view of like what are some of the tropes of love, like walking on the beach at sunset, and they project those tropes into one another. And so this inherent meaning that governs human relationship is gone, and modern consumer society is basically responsible for this, and their whole endeavor is around restoring this sort of more authentic relationship to others. And like I think what you see here with the city, for instance, how do we sort of let sort of a deep sense of self govern how we view, how we connect with others versus those more utilitarian sort of externally mandated aspects. Now it's a very, very simplistic thing. There's many resources I can share. There's a whole talk around this, but that is sort of roughly the thing. They also believed in workers' councils. So that's kind of the more philosophical in terms of like the societal model they advocated for is a workers' council. So the idea of where your society would be arranged as a sort of archipelago of workers' council that would sort of each work together to manage, factories and means of production. And so that's kind of, and that's not altogether, like, they were like the council communists, I think, kind of came up with that. So that's not altogether revolutionary. I think what's more interesting is what I mentioned originally, which is their conception of what is a spectacle and how does that govern the way in which we relate to one another.
It sounds like we might have to have you back to give that.
No, but
Yeah.
I'm gonna stick around here to answer only questions. Thanks for coming, Mehdi, and for suffering through these 30 minutes.
So again, a big thank you to our presenter tonight, Mehdi El Hajoui, and to you for attending this Book Club of California presentation. Please join us for our next program, Monday, March 11th at 6 o'clock. The title is Empress San Francisco, the Pacific Rim, the Great West, and California at the Panama Pacific International Exposition. This is an in-person and virtual presentation by author and professor of history from Carroll University, Abigail M. Markwin. You can register for that program or any of our programs online at bccbooks.org/programs. You could also email any of the staff here at the book club and we can register you for a program. Thank you again for joining us this evening. Please take a few moments to look at the exhibition as we start to wind down.
Oh, one more thing.
Yeah.
There's we have a wonderful booklet that Kevin helped design that is available. I think it has all the content covered. So if you want to take a bit of a keepsake home, it's available.
So yeah, and a little exhibition guide and checklist is in the back on the table. It's 8.5 by 11 folded booklet. You're more than welcome to take a copy of it. If there aren't enough, just let us know. We probably have a couple more in the back and we can make sure you get one this evening. So please take an exhibition guide. Thank you everyone for coming and we'll see you again soon here at the book club.